Okay, welcome to another video, and I'm glad you guys came on, and I hope that this one will be helpful for you. And I can ask you to go to this particular presentation in your packets. Remember that we're still in ecology, so we're still looking at organisms and how they interact in their environment. But in the last unit, we were looking a little more at kind of how organisms get certain chemicals, carbon, oxygen, water, nitrogen. We looked at that information a little bit, and we spent a little more time looking about on the interactions between the different organisms. And today, what I'd like to focus in on is a little bit more of how the relationships are and how they feed together. So this one's going to look more at the energy that each organism gets as they feed or eat upon other organisms in their environments, in their ecosystem. So let's start. I'm going to talk about how energy flows and how chemicals flow in ecosystems, and I'm going to also help to explain what a trophic level is and what that has to do with food chains and food webs. So everything today is really on this presentation is a little bit more on the eating side of things, not on the chemical side of things. And as you guys probably know, every organism needs energy, whether that's light from the sun or for us it's for food. When organisms use light to make their own food, that we call that chemical energy or sugar. That's called photosynthesis. And some of that energy is then eaten by other organisms and then they're used, and sometimes it's released as heat and sometimes it's released as running around or chasing something, but they have to use some of the energy, and some of it's lost as heat. I think you probably know this from other classes. I'll make this real quick, but we call something that does not make its own food, that has to feed off of a producer, off of a photosynthetic organism, or on other consumers, we call that a consumer. And something that feeds off of dead material or waste material is called a decomposer, meaning they decompose or break down the waste, or the dead, kind of the dead animals that might die in nature. And I think you probably have heard of food chains before, but a food chain is a path that takes you from starting at the producer, at the photosynthetic level, and then what eats that, what eats that, what eats that. When we talk about what's eating what, that's called a food chain. And then we actually assign levels to them, and that's a feeding level is called a trophic level. Troph or trough means to feed. So we're going to talk about those different levels. The first one is the producer level, which I've already talked about. The producers are things that make their own food. They're the first trophic level. They're photosynthesis, photosynthetic organisms that do photosynthesis. And there's plants on the ground, in terrestrial. And then in the water, there's also organisms that do photosynthesis that aren't plants. They're protists, bacteria, algae, and even some plants that are plants, except that they're water plants. We call them aquatic plants rather than land plants. And obviously, because these guys make their own food, they are the support for all the other trophic levels, all the other levels of organisms that don't make their own food. So it all starts down with these guys, the producers. And then comes the consumers. And if you look at this diagram right here in this PowerPoint, you'll notice that there's producers down at the bottom. The things that eat the producers are called primary consumers. The things that eat the primary consumers are called secondary, and so forth. So they're categorized based on what they eat. If it's an herbivore, it's something that eats only plants. If it's a carnivore, it eats other animals, or what we sometimes call meat eaters. And then an omnivore eats both plants or photosynthetic organisms and consumers. So I guess you could say kind of meat and plants. And they're put in a position on their food chain. Again, the first level is called the primary consumer. These are all what we call trophic levels. So primary consumer is a trophic level. These are not really herbivore, carnivore, and omnivore. Just talk about what they eat. But when we talk about a trophic level, we're talking about these terms that you see right here on this diagram, where it says primary consumer and so on. And like I mentioned, each one of those eats each other. We mentioned decomposers a couple of seconds ago. Those are things that break down what we call detritus organisms or detritus waste, which is waste or remains of dead organisms. And things that eat that are called detritus organisms. Sometimes you might hear them called scavengers. Examples are earthworms, rodents, insects, crayfish. The one that you're probably familiar with are vultures. And the main thing that does decomposing are bacteria and fungi. So when you see some kind of animal that might die in the woods or something, that's going to be broken down mainly by bacteria or fungi. And they take those chemicals and recycle them back into the soil. A food web is a bunch of food chains put together. So you'll notice here that there's not just one line leading to another line. There's one line leading to the fungi, another line leading to the fungi. This branches out to here and to the arthropods and the nematodes. And when you put together a bunch of different food chains like this, it's called a food web, an interconnected group of food chains. We're going to make these in class. I'd like you to take a second. I'll pause in a second for I'll count to 3 and let you pause the video. I'd like you to try to answer these 3 questions and bring them to class tomorrow. One is how the movement of energy and the movement of chemicals is different. One asks you to identify trophic levels, and I have a little sentence there for you to read. And another one is looking in your book at a certain figure and trying to identify some trophic levels in that ecosystem of the desert that's mentioned there. And then I want to quickly talk about how energy flows from one organism to the next. And we're going to talk about how that's related to a term called productivity. And we're going to also talk about 3 types of what we call food or ecological pyramids. Then you've probably heard of these too. Take a look at this diagram. This shows you the different productivity of different kinds of ecosystems. So there's, what we live in is a temperate deciduous forest, tropical rainforest. You can see a desert doesn't have hardly any productivity. Productivity is determined by photosynthesis and the sun. And what we consider productivity is how much the producers are making, how much food they're making. If they make lots and lots of food, or if there's lots and lots of plants, then we say it has a high biomass, and we say that it's got high productivity. And so you can see here that tropical rainforests obviously have a very diverse amount of vegetation, of photosynthetic plants, whereas something like the desert clearly does not. And that's what we determine when we determine productivity, the rate at which the producers build food. And obviously that determines how much energy will be available to any of the other levels that are above it, because if there's not that many plants, there's not going to be enough food to sustain everybody all the way up the food chain. And last but not least, I want to talk about pyramids. These are diagrams that show how energy flows through an organism, and most of the time the energy is lost as it goes from one level to the next. And I'll discuss that in just a second. The producer level is the bottom, it's the foundation, and there are 3 kinds of pyramids that we can show, but they all look exactly the same. They're just showing different things. One is called an energy pyramid, one's called a pyramid of biomass, and one's called a pyramid of numbers. And quickly, I'll show you those. This is an example of an energy pyramid. It shows you how many calories you get from certain things. You get a lot of energy from the producers, but since a lot of that energy is used by, let's say, this cricket here to fly and to do its normal day activities, so a lot of it's lost, and only 10% of the energy is made available to the next level. So that by the time you get up to these big guys, these tertiary consumers, they aren't getting nearly as much energy as they could have gotten if they were down eating the plants themselves. It's just the way it worked out evolutionary-wise. And so it's not a bad thing exactly, but it is something that you need to be aware of, that energy is lost with each step that you go up, because these organisms each have to do some work and live their lives and use up some of that energy. So there's only 10% available to the next higher group. And a lot of it's lost as heat. So obviously it takes a lot of vegetation, a lot of plants, look at that big block here, to support all the higher up levels. The biomass period looks the same. Biomass just refers to how much you have in a certain area, in a certain square meter. So this is an example of something in Florida where you can see that the actual mass of the producers is also higher per meter squared than any of the other ones, and it narrows very sharply. And the last one is what we call pyramid of numbers, and this just literally looks just at the numbers, how many of the organisms at that level there are. And for every 5,800,000, according to this, every 5,800,000 or so plants only is enough to survive to feed 3 tertiary consumers. So as you can tell, you got to have a lot of the producers in order to feed everything that's above it. And I mentioned all these already, but the foundation, the bottom, the producers, is almost always the widest section. The only time that that's not true is if you have, like, let's say 100 ants that all live on one particular tree. If that's the case, then I guess the primary consumers would be a bigger level than the producers, but that's not very often. Most of the time when you look at a whole ecosystem, producers always have way more, millions of organisms per, and compared to something like a tertiary consumer where there's not that many. These guys are big, they need a lot of energy, so they're only going to be able to be survived by to be nourished by all of these producers, these 5 million producers. So it's really weird to think about that. And that's the end of the presentation, and I'm going to go check and see if this worked now. I hope that you guys got something out of that, and I look forward to talking to you guys in class about this. Thanks, bye.